Imagine a whole nation literally transformed from the ground up in just 4 years. No massive foreign bailouts, no slow, decades-long gradual reform, just a sweeping, radical overhaul led by a dynamic 33-year-old military captain who seized power and immediately set about rewriting the destiny of his entire country. Today, in this explainer, we're unpacking the fascinating, incredibly complex, and ultimately tragic story of Thomas Sankara and the revolution of Burkina Faso.
Right off the bat, you have to understand that Sankara's approach to leadership was just entirely unique. While so many political leaders of his era, and honestly ours too, relied on massive cults of personality, Sankara flatly refused to have his portrait hung in public places. When people ask him why, his response was simple, but so profound. He said, "There are 7 million Thomas Sankaras." He firmly believed the revolution didn't belong to him at all. It belonged to the population. But to grasp the weight of this movement, we really need to understand what exactly he was revolting against.
And the sheer scale of his ambition? It was evident immediately. When Sankara took power in 1983, his country was known as Upper Volta. That was a colonial designation originally given by the French, and it was an impoverished West African nation deeply, deeply reliant on foreign aid. Well, by 1984, on the very first anniversary of his rule, he completely rebranded the nation's identity. He renamed it Burkina Faso, which translates from local languages to the land of upright men, or honorable people. He even wrote the new national anthem himself. It was this bold, anti-imperialist declaration that they were charting a brand new, economically self-reliant course.
So where did all this intense revolutionary fervor actually come from? Let's transition into our next section, roots and political ideas, and trace this back to his early life.
His evolution as a leader is actually super fascinating. Born in 1949 to a privileged Catholic family, his parents initially intended for him to become a priest, but instead he chose the military. It was during his officer training, first at home and later in Madagascar in the early 1970s, that he was exposed to progressive, Marxist, and anti-imperialist ideas. He saw popular uprisings in Madagascar firsthand, and he started reading deeply into history and military strategy. So by the time he seized power in a popularly supported coup in 1983, he had forged this very specific, ironclad worldview. And that worldview was firmly rooted in anti-imperialism. In practice, for him, this meant fiercely opposing the political and economic dominance of former colonial powers. Sankara aggressively rejected the influence of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the former colonial power, France. He firmly believed that if you accept their loans and their capital, you are essentially accepting their control over your country's future.
This entire philosophy is perfectly distilled in one of his most famous quotes, "He who feeds you controls you." Sankara realized that his nation, where 90% of the population were agrarian farmers, frequently suffered from these devastating droughts and food shortages. He argued that true independence was literally impossible if they had to rely on imported food and foreign aid just to survive day to day. And it was this exact philosophy that catalyzed his intense, uncompromising push for domestic agricultural self-sufficiency.
Okay, so that brings us to the actual results of those policies. Let's shift focus to transforming Burkina Faso and examine the tangible, data-driven accomplishments Sankara achieved during his incredibly brief time in power. Basically, what did he actually manage to do well? Check out this number, 2.5 million. In a matter of mere weeks, his government launched a massive public health campaign that vaccinated 2.5 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles. Before his presidency, the infant mortality rate was hovering near 21%, but during his tenure, that number dropped significantly. And get this, his administration was also the first African government to publicly recognize the AIDS epidemic as a major threat.
This massive mobilization extended straight into environmental reform too. 10 million. That is the number of trees his government planted in just 15 months to halt the creeping desertification of the Sahel. Now keep in mind, this was the 1980s, when global ecological awareness was still pretty low. But Sankara demonstrated remarkable foresight here. He criminalized bushfires and chaotic firewood cutting because he recognized that environmental protection was completely inextricably tied to the actual survival of his people.
And the transformations kept rolling, particularly in education. At the start of his rule, the national literacy rate was a mere 13%. Through massive, nationwide literacy campaigns and school-building projects that were driven by community labor, that number absolutely skyrocketed to 73% by 1987.
He also brought an unprecedented focus to gender equality.
In a deeply traditional and male-dominated society, Sankara made women's liberation a core pillar of his social revolution. His government banned female genital mutilation, outlawed forced marriages, and made polygamy illegal. But he actually went further. He actively appointed women to high government cabinet positions, recruited them into the military, and even formed an all-woman motorcycle personal guard. He publicly stated, "There is no true social revolution without the liberation of women."
Now, to fund all these massive social programs without taking any foreign aid, Sankara demanded extreme financial discipline and absolute solidarity with the poor. He stripped away the lavish perks of government officials. I mean, he literally sold off the entire government fleet of luxury Mercedes-Benz cars. In their place, he made the Renault 5, which was the absolute cheapest car available in Burkina Faso at the time, the official service car for all his ministers.
And the thing is, he didn't just enforce these strict rules on others, he lived them. He slashed his own presidential salary down to just $450 a month. He famously banned air conditioning in his office because he felt it was a luxury unavailable to the vast majority of Burkinabés. His personal possessions upon his death were reportedly limited to a car, a few bikes, 3 guitars, a fridge, and a broken freezer. He was absolutely 100% committed to living the very realities he asked of his citizens.
However, completely overhauling an entire society in just 4 years requires immense force. So let's pivot to controversies and control, to impartially examine the strict, authoritarian methods he used to mandate this rapid transformation, because the sources highlight a really complex duality here.
While the rapid social progress was undeniable, it came with a steep authoritarian price tag. Believing that certain institutions were standing in the way of his radical plans, Sankara banned trade unions and a free press. When teachers went on strike in 1986, his government fired nearly 2,500 of them. He also completely stripped the powerful traditional Mossi chiefs of their long-held rights, including their ability to hold courts or collect tribute. Now, while this helps nationalize land and boost wheat production by an incredible 75%, it severely alienated those powerful local leaders and the Burkinabé middle class.
Furthermore, to counter opposition and root out corruption, he established popular revolutionary tribunals. While these were initially popular with the public for finally holding corrupt officials accountable, they seriously lacked basic international legal protections. Defendants were denied legal counsel and essentially had to prove themselves innocent. Amnesty International and other human rights groups criticized his government for arbitrary detentions. Our sources note that these tribunals were sometimes hijacked by individuals using them to punish so-called lazy workers or simply to settle private scores. Over time, this alienation eventually set the stage for tragedy. Let's move into our next section, betrayal and overthrow, and look at the climax of his rule, along with the geopolitical tensions that ultimately led to his violent downfall. Sankara's unyielding anti-imperialist stance left him relatively isolated in West Africa. He openly criticized French leaders and ended up alienating neighboring countries. Things escalated badly in late 1985 with the Agadir Strip War, a brief but very destructive border conflict with neighboring Mali. Burkina Faso's military struggled against Malian forces, and this noticeably damaged the domestic credibility of Sankara's government. Tensions just continued to mount, both at his borders and, crucially, within his own inner circle.
The tragic end finally arrived on October 15, 1987. Armed men burst into a meeting, singling out and assassinating Thomas Sankara and 12 of his aides. The coup was actually orchestrated by his second-in-command and closest friend, Blaise Compaoré. Compaoré justified the violent overthrow by claiming Sankara was jeopardizing relations with France and the Ivory Coast. Sankara's body was dismembered and quickly buried in an unmarked grave. Compaoré then seized power and ruled as a dictator for the next 27 years, immediately reversing the nationalizations, rejoining the IMF, and overturning nearly all of Sankara's social policies.
It's a really dark conclusion. But it's actually preceded by a hauntingly prophetic moment. Just 1 week before his assassination, while reflecting on the 20th anniversary of Che Guevara's death, Sankara delivered a speech where he stated, "While revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered, you cannot kill ideas."
And the sources suggest he may have been absolutely right about that. To conclude our explainer today, let's examine his enduring legacy and how his 4 short years in power have cast a massive shadow over modern African politics.
Decades after his death, Sankara's legacy has only grown stronger. Known globally today as Africa's Che Guevara, he remains a super powerful symbol of anti-corruption and Pan-African self-reliance. Following a popular uprising in 2014 that finally ousted Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's remains were exhumed, and a long-delayed quest for justice began, which resulted in Compaoré being found guilty of his murder in absentia. According to our sources, Sankara and his aides were reinterred in a mausoleum in 2025. Today, his rhetoric heavily inspires the current Burkinabe leadership under Ibrahim Traoré, and his image is worn proudly by youth movements all across the continent demanding true sovereignty and economic independence.
So, what should you ultimately take away from all this? Thomas Sankara was a leader of profound contradictions, a man who achieved breathtaking social and economic progress through rigid and often oppressive authoritarian control. His physical life was cut brutally short, and his immediate policies were quickly reversed by his successor. Yet his vision for a self-reliant Africa has survived for decades, outlasting the very people who tried to bury him in an unmarked grave. It leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to ponder. When a leader is assassinated, does it extinguish their vision, or does it simply make them immortal? Can ideas truly be killed?